applause even before I tell you about him. I love that. But I'll make it quick. Founder and executive director of the Polis Institute. Many of you know Phil. He's spent his career designing solutions to complex social problems. He's done a lot of work in the environmental space, and most recently, poverty and homelessness. Please help me welcome Phil.
Use this mic and stop me if I'm in error here. I'm really delighted to have this kicked off by a map of zip codes. Our bread and butter is neighborhood work, and actually we go a little bit more resolute than zip code down to the neighborhood level, but that's a great place to start. However, Eric asked me to contextualize some of our comments today more broadly in terms of American poverty. And so I'll attempt to do that and provide as many specifics as I can about at least my opinions on what we ought to do. A report was submitted very recently to the Council on Human Rights at the United Nations a couple weeks ago. It amounts to an indictment on American poverty, how we're addressing poverty. Philip Alston is its author. He serves as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights. Not everyone in America views the UN with affection or values their opinion, but his assessment is timely and instructive for us. I'll reflect on a few of his observations and compare that with some of our core American ideals in order to answer a specific question. Can we create a more broad-based prosperity in America through our current set of ideals? Can we create a more broad-based prosperity in America through our current set of ideals? This set I'm talking about is what we could call Americanism: liberty, egalitarianism, individualism, democracy, and a laissez-faire economic system that prefers a business sector unencumbered by government intervention. This set of ideals informs a theory that I think we are offering the world. The American theory is that employing these ideals to maximize the production of wealth leads to the greatest good. That maximizing the production of wealth leads to the greatest good. So the business sector is obviously very important to that theory because this sector alone produces wealth, which is then redistributed through the other sectors, government and charity. So they're of utmost importance, but not alone in this effort. So is it working, especially as related to poverty? Has maximizing production of wealth led to the greatest good for our most vulnerable citizens? This report from Philip Alston says no. It's pretty rough. It's worth reading, but it's like, prepare yourself. He has a few nice comments in there, but it's mainly, like I said, an indictment. And so I'm going to go through just 3 of the things that he mentions and give some context there. The first one is the number of children living in poverty. Alston points out that 1/4 of American youth live in poverty, and this is the highest across the 37 member countries of the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development that was formed after World War II. The OECD average is 14%, we're about 25%. So when we look at that, it's important to remind ourselves that the lived experience of those children in poverty is not the same. It's not a monolithic group. Some of them are, all of them are labeled that way, but not everyone knows it. Technically, I grew up in poverty. But I didn't really know it. You know, my parents didn't talk about it. They were educated. They were working to help other people in poverty, but we didn't talk about it a lot. And our labels are really, really important. I had the privilege of hearing from Dr. Clara Walters a couple weeks ago. She's a lifelong educator and was the Jones High School principal in the 80s. And she takes tremendous and passionate exception to our labels on children in poverty. And she's worth listening to. Dr. Clara Walters. And she says that since the 80s, we've been calling children at risk of failure. And guess what? We've seen a lot of failures. And she says what we should be talking about is at promise of greatness. I think Dr. Walters believes in our set of American ideals, right? That's worth a round of applause. And while the language about our next generation is very important, it's also equally important that we are educating them well. And also as important is that we include and support the parents of those raising them, right? We have a tendency in our country to vilify the poor, especially parents of children that are in poverty. Why aren't you making better choices? And the list goes on. But if we're going to set up a child for their success, we can't do that without including those raising them. And there are ways to do that, but we have to be intentional. Doing everything we can to ensure genuine opportunity for the next generation is certainly in line with our clearest American ideals. We believe in egalitarianism, and starting off in a place where you're behind requires extra lifting by the society to help you succeed. And I think that is clear. So firstly, he talks about child poverty. The next thing that I will point out from his report is what he calls income inequality. In the OECD, this group of 37 nations, America ranks pretty much dead last in terms of wealth concentration and its effects on poverty and inequality. He rightly points out that such inequality undermines a very important social ideal in America, that of democracy. It costs a lot of money to win major elections in our country, and if the money is predominantly in the hands of a few people, they're driving political outcomes, and that's unstable. In our country, we have an extreme version of this wealth concentration. We hear a lot about the 1%. Since the 70s, which is the most of my life, the personal wealth of this group has doubled, while the average wealth of middle class has stagnated and debts have risen. I find it more instructive, though, to look at the 60% in our country. That's who holds over 100% of the wealth, which means there's 40% in our country that have negative net worth. And that is what we're looking at when we're talking about addressing poverty. Nearly half of our populace is underwater. And how do we address that? And how do we look at our policies and practices in a way that's humble and includes us all in complicity with that? It's not just their bad choices. It's more than that. This wealth of concentration is showing no signs of slowing down. In light of many proposed policies at the national level, it will only continue to increase. The rise in the stock market is increasing, and this is increasing the concentration. 10% of the wealthiest people have 84% of the stocks. I don't begrudge anyone for making money on the market. Wish I did. I tried. I bought high, sold low, so it's not my thing. So I can't give anybody stock advice, but I can say that that this concentration, it doesn't include everybody. So I don't think the Dow doing well right now is our best sign of broad-based prosperity. It's an indicator of something, but it's not an indicator of that, because most Americans are just not in the game, especially our most poor neighbors. Philanthropy for us in America is a really significant part of the economic puzzle. Because we rely heavily on the business sector, we also rely heavily on generosity. Unfortunately, we have a lot of very generous people in our country, so they make good use of their wealth. They supply it to charities and do it at a world-setting pace. The Gates Foundation, this is worth noting for this conference, if you're not aware, has just announced $158 million to address poverty in America. I would love to see our community be right in the midst of that, not only benefiting from the resources, but contributing to the way that they're going at it through what they learned in their bumps in the education space, they're going to be listening, I think, a lot more to practitioners working to alleviate poverty. So in order to address this concentration of wealth, what we need, I think, is the government to do its job better, and making sure that those with this wealth are being treated the same and not being treated exceptionally, and that this talk we have of campaign finance reform really takes hold so that you can't buy elections or the civil servants. I believe that our civil servants get in this because they want to serve. And all we got to do is unleash them to do that and not have those two sectors too thoroughly enmeshed. Thirdly and lastly, from his report, he talks about incarceration rates. I'm gonna break decorum here and just say this one really pisses me off. In the land of opportunity and liberty, we have the highest incarceration rates in the world. And that is a travesty. And the poor are most adversely affected by this incarceration and the rampant use of criminalization to control the populace. This is a direct affront to liberty, which may be our highest ideal. We have taken to levy fines for trivial offenses and then mount them up, and then people end up in jail, unable to really pay their way out. And we do that in some parts of our country, the homeless population for sure, and we certainly do it to our drug-addicted population. It's really time that we start to view drug addiction for what it is a health problem. It is not a moral failing. And until we start doing that, our incarceration rates are not going to improve. Using jails and prisons to try to control this is not wise or just. Those who end up in prison for these charges, drug charges, tend to be poor. You don't sit in prison on drug charges if you're wealthy, period. Does that seem just to you? No, it doesn't. And it proves, I think, the point that those drug charges, it shouldn't be something we're incarcerated for by and large. Not only are incarcerated populations poor, they also tend to be non-white. Our practice of incarceration is extremely racist. There are more blacks in prison right now than any time in our nation's history. We imprison more blacks currently than South Africa did at the height of the apartheid. And most of these are in jail, prison for drug-related charges. In some states, blacks are jailed on charges at rates 50 times that of whites, while blacks and whites use and sell drugs at remarkably similar rates. Incarceration is an obvious and direct affront to this preeminent ideal of liberty, and we should do something about this. These people in our prisons and jails for nonviolent offenses should simply not be there. They should be out earning wages and providing for their families. But our workforce is struggling. I realize that our employment rate is now presently low, which is a good thing, but many of those jobs do not provide for a life-sustaining wage, and that is prevalent in our region. Not having a well-paying job is not an excuse for criminal behavior, but if there are actually limited options for people, we should see our own social complicity in the problem and not just blame them for taking a choice that we might otherwise take in the same situation. So, the question that I started with, can we create a more broad-based prosperity by employing the ideals of our country? I say yes, we can. We just have to take them much more seriously than we do. The ideas of liberty, egalitarianism, democracy are super important and things we can build on to address poverty. I'm going to mention a couple others that I would like to see elevated, and if you know me, you're not going to be surprised when I say these, to our collection of ideals, and that is dignity and interdependence, which I can lump together in a phrase called dignified interdependence. Dignity is the fundamental value of the human being, and without an honest appreciation of what everyone has to offer, we will make no progress in creating a broad-based prosperity. This gets into personal belief. We all need some kind of resilient rationale for why people matter. I believe dignity is both intrinsic and luminous. It is a fundamental value that I think comes from being created in the image of God. Other people get there from different angles, but it's important that you get there somehow, because you'll very quickly meet someone who will challenge your belief that everyone matters, because we can be pains in the collective behinds and individual behinds. And so it's really important that we really genuinely think people matter. Basic human value, everyone deserves a profound amount of respect for that. This is a gift in my view. We don't so much give people dignity as affirm what they already have. And it's important we see it that way, I think. But then people can build on this intrinsic dignity with what I call luminous dignity. That's when somebody really is operating at the height of their gifts, and you can see them shine, and it affects other people. And we should unencumber people from things that stop them from fully illuminating their gifts and assets to the world. That's our job. And when we do that, we'll find opportunities to build on this second piece, which is about interdependence. Interdependence requires a healthy, thriving individual to voluntarily create a relationship with someone else, and that's when we're at our strongest. We need to do more of that. We need to do more of that along our social sectors and in our neighborhoods, where we are seeing the value of everyone. They're able to shine through their giftedness, and we can work together to solve our most common problems and solve and celebrate our shared successes. Thank you so much.